Hello, my name is Steve Hauk. I'm an art dealer and writer. Here to talk a little bit about Charlton Fortune, who was one of the founders of the Monterey History and Art Association, and perhaps California's greatest early impressionist. She was born in 1885 in the Bay Area, Sausalito, and was born with a cleft palate. And in those days, that couldn't be fixed. And so she carried that all her life. It made for a difficult childhood. Still, her parents and her family had a decent amount of money, and she studied art in Scotland and England in her teen years, but would come back to the Bay Area. In 1906, the San Francisco earthquake and fire, she lost her home. It was dynamited to stop the fire. It didn't work, but she and her mother roamed that whole night. And they pinned little labels to their jackets, giving their names and addresses. And they found out the next day that a lot of people did that because the fear of death was not as great as the fear of being anonymous. She overcame these things to become, as I said, one of the great artists. She was somewhat of a modernist, an impressionist, very much a colorist. When she was in her early 40s, she turned to liturgical art. She was a Catholic. She didn't wear it on her sleeve, but she was a strong Catholic. Because of that, because of turning to the liturgical art, later on she stopped doing Impressionism. Her paintings have gone for 5, 6, and 7 figures, partially because they're brilliant, also because they're very rare, because she lived into her 80s, dying in 1969. But there's not that much of her work as there is of other artists who do kind of a full life of that. I wrote a play on her. I call it Fortune's Way, Our Notes on Art for Catholics and Others, and it was done last year in the area. Probably be done more this year. I set it toward the end of World War II, the 1943, 44, 45 period. And the reason I did was because of what is going on today in the world, the economy, the wars, the general stress level we're all experiencing. I look back at Fortune's life. Here's a young woman. It's hard to make it as an artist, even if you're a male at that time. As a woman, it was extra hard. But she grows up with a cleft palate, her house destroyed. Her brother goes off in World War I as a civil engineer looking for oil. She survives the Great Depression. World War II, again, she worries about her brother, who's older now, and overseas looking for oil. She comes out of all of that, and she's a great artist. I would think she might have had 12 breakdowns during that time. When you compare it to what's going on now, that was just such an awful lot for those people going through those things. Yet she not only won the silver medal at the Paris Salon, she won the gold medal from the American Institute of Architects for design, and that was for her religious work. She was later awarded a medal by the Pope for designing churches, which is what she did in the 30s when she turned to religious art. She formed something called the Monterey Guild. The group met in Monterey, but then they decorated churches and cathedrals across the country. A year and a half ago at Bonham's, a big oil of hers came up for auction of the Monterey waterfront. It was about 30 by 40 inches. They had an estimate of $400,000 to $600,000 on it. It went for $1.8 million. It was interesting that Fortune signed her paintings Charlton Fortune and went by that. Most of the women artists of that period used an initial, and the reason was they thought they got a fairer break from judges if the judges didn't know they were a woman artist. And it actually worked. There was an artist, Mary Danielle Morgan, who would sign M. Danielle Morgan, and in the 30s she was judged in San Francisco, and a critic for the San Francisco Chronicle said, Mr. Morgan shows bold masculine strokes. So, that worked. It worked. Fortune may have done that, used the E for her first initial, but also supposedly she didn't like her first name, which was Euphemia, and friends called her Effie. I read recently in the Book of Tea that great paintings and plays and novels, they often leave a little for you to fill in, that draws you into it. They don't connect all the dots. Fortune was that way. Her great impressionistic work, it's a little vapory, the colors are gorgeous, but she doesn't do all the details. When she did landscapes with figures in them, she basically left the face blank because she felt that the artist should be able to express what the person was thinking and feeling by their body posture. her colors are way beyond her time, reds, blues, yellows. When she came along, most of the artists were doing something called tonalism, which is closely related, browns and greens and yellows, more mood things. She kind of was one of the artists that broke that mold. She was considered a modernist in some ways, which was again ironic because years later she kind of rebelled against what was coming up and then considered modern. There's a famous group called the Society of Six, and their paintings are much sought after. And they influenced artists on the East Coast and perhaps even Europe. And a lot of them were influenced by Fortune. So you can see that she just had this kind of power that went out and out and out, especially when you consider it was just a 25 or 30 year period when she was doing this painting. She had quite an effect. Fortune was probably considered the leading woman artist from this area, and Armand Hansen was considered the leading male artist. He did a lot of paintings of fishermen. He had shipped out in Europe when he was studying in Germany. I think he probably saw a few people drown, and he was very taken with that kind of passion. Fortune also did fishermen, but she did them at a distance. She did harbor and things like that. California Impressionism has made its mark around the country basically in the last 25 or 30 years, though these artists most of them made really good livings during their time and did fairly well. They were not starving. People always think that an artist just gets famous when they die. Sometimes they disappear because the strong personality is not there, and that helps sell paintings. But Hansen and Fortune were among a group of maybe 25 or 30 leading painters of that time. Arthur Matthews was in San Francisco. Marion Wachtel was in Los Angeles. They were all wonderful painters. Here you had Mary Denille Morgan. Xavier Martinez was here part of the time. Gottardo Piazzoni, very great painter. And most of them go from anywhere from $10,000 to $1.5 million to this day. And I think a lot of them would be shocked by that. One of the things artists to California, and they came from everywhere. They came from England and Germany and France, and they came from Cleveland and St. Louis and Baltimore and New England. Sometimes it might take them, once they arrived here, 4 or 5 years to get to California, but most of them, once they arrived, a lot of them would be here for a couple months, then go back to their original city. The same thing was happening sort of in New Mexico and Taos too, that they would find that this is a place that was interesting and that they could paint in year round. I mean, if you're an impressionist painter in Massachusetts or Maine, you can only get out 6 or 7 months a year, and so that had an appeal. It also had an appeal because California was growing, was in a different state of flux than the East Coast and the Midwest. And most of the painters would come out and stay. Same thing happened with a lot of the writers, of course, too. Real quick story on Charlton Fortune, which shows our travels. The Monterey Museum of Art did a major show on her about 12, 15 years ago. This is the catalog on it, and it's a good thing to read. By the way, this is by the Carmel Art Association, and that's on Fortune, and that's a really wonderful book to read. And it has a lot of information on her. Anyway, there's a show at the museum, and I'm standing there with the director, Richard Gadd. I think it was Richard, it might have been somebody else. And the Fortune show was going on. It was a Thursday afternoon, and the museum was not crowded. And there were 2 or 3 people looking at the paintings, and all of a sudden we heard this man yell, "Yippee!" And he comes running out. And we said, "Why did you just say yippee? Did you like the paintings?" He said, no. He said, "I'll be back in 15 or 20 minutes. And he drove off. He came back, pulled his car up. We heard the screech. He came running out with a painting about this big by Charlton Fortune that he had bought 3 weeks ago in a pawn shop in London for about 20 pounds. And it must have been worth, even at that time, $30,000 or $40,000. I wrote a film called Time Captured in Paintings, The Monterey Legacy, and it plays on PBS. It was done through the museum. We got a great narrator in Jack Lemmon. I mean, that was really wonderful. It won a Cine Golden Eagle, and in researching the film, what I really learned is that these people had a lot of courage. They had a lot of courage. It was tough to be an artist then. It was tough to be in an area that was kind of wild. You didn't know if you could make a living. If you were a woman artist, it was really difficult. And these people are really important. To go just a little bit before the Impressionists, some of the artists that came earlier, like Thomas Hill and Thomas Moran, and the same sort of painters, and they would have known some of these people. They would have been in their 50s and 60s when the others would have been in their 20s and 30s. If it wasn't for them, we probably wouldn't have Yosemite. We probably wouldn't have Yellowstone. We wouldn't have the records of Native Americans we do. They did paintings that got back to the East Coast. There was one story of an explorer who discovered a mountain and wanted to name it after himself, and somebody said, wait, you better check. And it ended up Thomas Moran had painted that mountain 5 years earlier. So he was not the first there.